I just think that, like, the idea that I'm trying to get across overall is that there's an individual and an environment.
Right.
You don't just
People
center
forget about
on
one
one.
or the other all
Right,
the time.
exactly.
Well,
Like,
I mean,
still try to
yeah.
improve both.
Right.
Well,
Right.
it's like with climate again. I mean, there's the environmental factor of the economic system, the market itself, you know. And so you have these oil companies going, well, you know, the profit motive and these other things, and so I'm going to sacrifice the future for profit. And so, I mean, that environmental factor is very real. If you create alternative incentives within the environment, it's going to shift behavior.
Exactly.
Right.
And there are many situations where that's going to be more effective than lecturing someone. Be like, well, you'll make a lot of money if you fuck us over, but don't do it because that's bad.
Looping back around a little bit to the whole like subsidy problem with electric cars and stuff like that. You know, that's I think one of the best ways to go about that is to make it so cheap to use sustainable products that the alternatives become silly, you know, because right now it's essentially the opposite. If you don't think about the ethical problems or the impact that it's having, then the less sustainable products are way cheaper. And that's the problem is most people are just at the supermarket, for instance, looking at price change and they're like, well, I could get this steak for $10 or this steak for 20. And you know, most people are going to obviously go for the cheaper option. Yeah. So I think one of the only ways that you can start to shift at least our society towards a more sustainable, you know, system or a more sustainable consumption is have heavy subsidies to drive the costs of better alternatives down, and maybe even taxes to drive the cost of, you know,
like
less
carbon tax.
That's what we need is to tax the people that
Carbon
are
tax.
subsidized for free, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, we need to start
that's a good
taking
idea.
into account the future cost. 'Cause, I mean, that's very real.
Well, that's, and again, that's, I guess, the worldview thing that I stressed earlier that I think is so important is to tie it to the whole idea of, like, the biosphere, because all of everything that we're talking about right now has to deal with, like, sustainability. Every time you say sustainability, you need to work, okay, well, what are you trying to sustain?
Right, yeah.
You know? And that's like, okay, well, if we have the biosphere to work with, at least we can say we have these resources. At the very least. These are the resources we know. But we can go I think we can go way more intricate than that, because we're also talking about, like, morals and stuff. Like, if you look at, like,
what kind of life do we want people to have?
Exactly.
That's really the core of the discussion.
Because you can live in a very wide variety of things. Humans are very good at adapting.
That's very different from a good life.
Exactly.
What we're capable of adapting to and what is, like, good for a, you know, vibrant and, you know, well-lived human life.
Long-term, too.
Yeah, long-term, for sure.
Because even, you know, I think that's a huge part of the climate problem, too, and the AI problem as well, is just the scope of it. Like, 50 years isn't, you know, 50 years is one of the short-term projections, or the shortest term projection for when we could have AGI on, like, an average. I can't remember exactly.
It was roughly, if you poll all computer scientists, the average computer scientist will tell you around 2050 is when they expect
2050?
AGI. Okay.
That's right around when we're going to start seeing some of the shitty parts of climate change.
So,
see, that's interesting too, is what are going to be the applications of AI?
I feel like the first thing it's going to do is fix climate change.
Yeah. So anyway, what I was trying to say with that, though, is that it's even if it's 32 years, which is shorter than 50, like I was saying, I feel like a lot of people have trouble abstracting, like, how to deal with that. You know, it's so far away. And a lot of people, too, I think, especially older generations, have this mentality of, you know, well, climate change may be happening, but I'll probably be dead when it hits, you know? And so,
well, I'm not going to be Graham, so like
so, you know, it's hard for people to make decisions here and now that make their lives harder, like spending more money on, you know, more sustainable food or whatever it may be, that will, you know, better the lives of people that they don't even know, or the future that they may not care about, for instance.
See, that's, I really do think that kind of, like, individual choices within the marketplace is completely insufficient, given the trajectory we're currently on. I think we need big, radical changes.
I think it's just logically incorrect, too. It's like, the moment that the system gets more power than the individual, it will always snowball then at that point.
Yeah.
The individual doesn't have choices anymore.
All hierarchies tend towards authoritarian dominance eventually.
Yep.
It's interesting though, because I mean, yeah, sure, like a small scale voting with your dollar doesn't really have a large scale impact, but if we can start movements where those types of things are happening on a much larger scale, I do think that could have an impact.
It could have an impact. I think the best, my own personal preference is that the best way I've seen it described is that we need a movement that understands that we need to change things in a more fundamental, systemic way, but that you should still have as part of that movement kind of that individual activism, less because you think it's going to be what fixes everything, and more just kind of like as a way in grounding your resistance and your own moral authority as an individual to say, it's a symbolic way to ground that resistance. And I really like that. That's a good idea. But if you get too stuck in the idea that it's your fault because you're not recycling and you're eating meat and you're driving your car, I think it's going to cause more harm than good. And even a serious effort by people to change that, I think, will not be strong enough to defeat the systemic forces that are going to push against them for their own interests.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a very good case to be made for that. And like the whole like be the change you want to see in the world, I think that's important for, like you're saying, moral consistency,
right?
And for you to really evoke that, you know, kind of rhetoric that helps to change people's minds.
For the stoic mindset.
Exactly. But it can't just be that, because it won't be enough. I agree with you.
And I think there's been a lot of effort to kind of push people into that way of thinking, because I think it just kind of turns their criticism inward instead of them going out to try to change something in the world.
Right. You gotta get that first, and then once you got your baseline, you gotta go out and actually help other people.
Exactly.
You know?
And it's also a very common fallacy that gets used. I think it's one of the more common ones that people don't call people on, is kind of like the YouTube fallacy, where it's like you come to someone for like a small scale example, you come to someone with a problem and you're like, hey, like, you know, I don't like it when you say, you know, negative things towards me. Right. And they're like, well, you say negative things towards me all the time. And it's okay, you know, so that's like a separate argument, right? It's like, okay, well, if you also have a problem, then we can talk about that afterwards. But right now we're talking about what you do to me, and that's this separate entity, right? And so it's kind of, you can extrapolate that up where, you know, somebody comes up and they're like, hey, like, I don't like that you're destroying the planet with, you know, such and such industry. And they're like, well, you buy meat all the time, and that's bad. Or you drive your car, and that's bad.
One does not cancel out the other.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you guys.
Go for
Thinking back to the nutritional side, what would you guys think about a sin tax on sugar? Like something like what we have on marijuana and alcohol and stuff like that, to try to like discourage.
I think that is completely reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, we do that with cigarettes, and that's been very effective.
Yeah, and we know how harmful sugar is now. Like,
it's bad.
Well, it's both harmful and addictive. It's literally like, I can't see any.
Yeah, it's nature's candy, man.
It's almost an even more insidious harm, at least now, because
it's in everything,
and because we don't
such
talk about it as
absurd
much.
level. Yeah, it's normalized. It's completely normalized.
Because the sugar industry did so much to suppress research for so long and
change the food pyramid. Like, what the fuck?
See, that's another thing. Is kind of like that, you know, that corporate, you know, manipulation of scientific you know, consensus is
like we were talking about earlier. The, you know, and that one is probably one of the most effective examples, where it's works better than almost anything.
Because it's so unconscious.
Yeah, that one's that's despicable. So yeah, I mean,
I'm
definitely
with you.
For a tax on that,
and
especially
take all that money and use it for health, public
public awareness, and
and even like a public healthcare system. If we want to try to fund one of those,
we need
in the
that
future.
no matter what.
I think it's been done in some really dumb ways. Like I know there was like the governor of New York a while back. I think Bloomberg. Anyway, he made big sodas illegal.
Oh yeah,
that's the stupidest way to deal with this problem I can think of.
It's just like marijuana, right? You bring it in, you give it a huge sin tax. People will pay a 40% tax and shit because they don't want to be criminals. You know, nobody's gonna have a black market of sugar if you put a 20% tax.
Use that money to help fix the problem.
Well, the moment that you actually.
Sorry, I was just going to say, especially high fructose corn syrup. But
the moment that you actually put the syntax on there, even if I don't even know how difficult that would be, probably fucking terribly difficult. But
the lobby,
but
sugar would fight that hard.
The moment that you do
same with oil, carbon tax. That's a big fucking fight.
But the moment that you do it, it's like that. People will ask why, you know, because it is one of those things that you're like, everyone or no one thinks about.
Right.
So it's like the moment you do it, they're like, what the fuck? This is like, why would that ever be a thing? And then you have to be like, well, here's what it does to you. And then you're like, oh!
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if that could spark a little more conversation about that, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like it's a tougher one too because it's so I don't know, integrated into so much of the food we eat. Whereas with something like cigarettes, it's easy to be like, okay, here's this thing you buy, and it's this isolated thing, and we just want you to stop smoking it. Like that's very different than like
and
we
luxury.
need to change how everyone makes food.
The idea would be that like cigarettes are luxury, but it's like if we just decided to take tobacco and spread it through like everything that's on the shelves in the fucking
right.
Well, like
It's like
fucking
nicotine
cocaine.
in your cereal.
Exactly.
Well, they used to put actual cocaine in Coke.
Yeah. Dude, yeah.
And now they basically do, again, with just like high fructose corn syrup at such high levels that, it's basically, it's still addictive. Although, of course, not as much, but still. Yeah.
Oh, no, nowhere near. So.
Yeah. But, yeah, like I was saying, it's almost more insidious because of that.
Yeah.